Have y'all ever wanted to go back in time to a particular era in history? Like, which one would you choose? And I think I would go back to, like, turn of the century Europe or the United States. And I think this is because this is a time where stuff really starts to change for human culture. For decades before this, you had these huge European empires that were civilized, that would go to foreign lands and exotic places and capture culture and artifacts and plants and animals and bring them back to their home countries. And on top of that, you have these new inventions like the airplane and the diving bell that could allow people to reach parts of the planet that we couldn't get to before. So the world suddenly became much more vast and grand because now you have all these facets that are undiscovered, these vantage points that hadn't been taken into consideration, and these cultural lenses through which the world hadn't been viewed before. So if you really wanted to adventure, yeah, you got like a pretty good shot at doing that. But this sense of adventure wasn't just limited to culture or art or music or architecture, but it spread into science as well. But now it was beginning to be a world full of tiny atoms and molecules, and then you get this weird marriage with chemistry where you start to bring in isotopes and radioactivity and the subatomic particle. I mean, for God's sakes, guys, the electron! The electron! So the early 1900s were a time where science was breaking new ground, there's new frontier, and because of that, many scientists were placed into situations where they didn't understand the risks and the hazards, because nobody really knew anything about the stuff they were studying. So this was a time when self-experimentation was starting to catch on. We look back and we go, what the hell were these guys thinking? Or ladies, Madame Curie. But what we often fail to realize now about that time is that this self-experimentation was often the most reliable and measurable way to discover things about this vast new world that had opened up in front of us. And it was noble to do experiments on yourself, because by harming yourself, you learn about something that benefits all of mankind. So one of these guys is Indian-British scientist JBS Haldane. JBS Haldane. Balls of steel. Look at this face. His face is no stranger to pain. So JBS Haldane was a man who probably, never slept. This is a guy who has way too many scientific accomplishments, so it's really hard to pick out, the most important ones. So Haldane is primarily known for his work with genetics and biochemistry. Haldane helped combine Mendelian genetics and Darwin's theory of natural selection through a process called linkage. Linkage occurs when two genes are really closely related spatially on a genome. So when one is selected for, the other one generally comes with it. He also pioneered an origin for all life on Earth by postulating that it's possible to build complex organic molecules from inorganic molecules, provided that the conditions are similar to something like primordial Earth. The point is, this guy was like a jack of all trades. He loved doing science, he loved writing about science, he loved talking about science, and he wasn't afraid to be bold. Just like me. I'm not afraid to be bold. But I think the real reason JBS Haldane deserves praise is through his work with decompression and compression. You know, with diving and climbing mountains and stuff, not squishing spongy things. I think JBS Haldane inherited a lot of this interest from his father, who studied a lot of this personally. His father's name, confusingly, J.S. Haldane. Outside of science, J.S. Haldane was famous for being really, really scatterbrained. So author Bill Bryson, in his book A Short History of Nearly Everything, tells a pretty famous story of J.S. Haldane. So apparently J.S.'s wife at a dinner party told him to go upstairs and to go change, but when he took his clothes off, he figured that it was bedtime and he got in his pajamas and just went to sleep. But apart from that, J.S. Haldane is famous for determining how much rest is needed during a dive to prevent a condition called nitrogen narcosis. So to figure this out, he spent a lot of time leading small teams of people through really hazardous conditions, like up Pikes Peak in Colorado while measuring the rate of respiration. J.S. Haldane did seem like a pretty cool dad, though. During J.B.S. Haldane's youth, he and his dad would test various gas masks in poisonous gases, and they would see who passed out first. Dad, I bet you I'll pass out first. Meow, son, you are full of lies. I will be the one who passes out first. Meow. So JBS Haldane later went on to Oxford, where he did not get a science degree. He'd never had one. Instead, he got a degree in classical literature. However, this was not before Haldane and his sister published a paper where they outlined genetic linkage in 300 guinea pigs that they bred in the front yard of their house. He later went off to World War I, calling it an enjoyable experience. Later on claiming that he enjoyed the opportunity of killing people. So when he got back from World War I, he held professorships and institutions, and he got a lot of great works out. Like, he published almost 30 books and some several hundred research papers. And I only have 2. Towards the end of his career, he started to become interested in decompression again. And so eventually he got the money to build something called the pressure pot, which was a giant steel cylinder with one little tiny window. And in that cylinder, you could control air pressure, gas concentration, and a lot of other factors that basically would just torture people. Yeah, but it was like all for science though, so it's good. So in this pressure pot, he would expose himself and his loved ones to varying air pressures, often rapidly changing air pressure in the sealed container from one extreme to another. Now, this wasn't just to test the limits of the human body, this was to simulate a rapid ascent of a diver from the bottom of the ocean to the surface. So basically, these experiments were like incredibly painful. Like, nearly every time someone was either vomiting or bleeding or convulsing in that chamber. Not to mention countless obliterated eardrums. JBS Haldane recalls of this that the drum generally heals up, and if a hole remains in it, although one is somewhat deaf, one can blow tobacco smoke out of the ear in question, which is a social accomplishment. But this is hardly the worst of it. One time he convulsed so dramatically in the pressure pot that he shattered many of his vertebrae. And then after another experiment, he went in and then couldn't feel his back or his butt for like 6 years. And one of the weirdest bits is that he would bring people into the chamber with him. As Bill Bryson describes, sent on a simulated descent, his wife once had a fit that lasted 13 minutes. When at last she stopped bouncing across the floor, she was helped to her feet and sent home to cook dinner. He even got an ex-Spanish prime minister named Josh Nelson, who afterward complained of a curious velvety sensation on the lips. He put himself in harm's way, he put his family in harm's way, and he did it to answer a question that was important not just to himself, but to people. Haldane's work with decompression and the bends formed the foundation of what we know today about dive safety, dive physiology, and even altitude sickness. And he did it all on himself. And the craziest part is he freaking loved it. He reveled in it. Like, that was who he was, and it's what he enjoyed. Because this is a man who found out that by drinking hydrochloric acid, you get, and I quote, a rather violent headache.